Welcome to the Aging Well podcast, where we explore the essential pillars of well-being: spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social well-being, guiding our listeners toward a life of health and longevity. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Neil Markey, co-founder and CEO of Beckley Retreats. Neil's inspiring journey spans from serving as a captain in the U.S. Army Special Operations 2nd Ranger Battalion, becoming a passionate advocate for mindfulness and plant-based treatments. Having personally navigated the challenges of PTSD and depression, Neil turned to psychedelics and meditation as pathways to healing, reshaping his perspective on the profound connections between science and spirituality. In this episode, Neil will share insights on the spiritual importance of well-being, the responsible use of psychedelics, and the transformative work of Beckley Retreats in promoting holistic health. Let's dive into this enlightening conversation with Neil Markey. Neil, welcome to the Aging Well podcast. I'm really fascinated with your story. Your background as a special operations captain is compelling, and in your transition into what you're doing now with Beckley Retreats. So can you share a little bit about yourself and what led you from military service to exploring mindfulness and psychedelics?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me, Jeff. Nice to spend some time together. I'll kind of give this short version, but I usually start my story in undergrad. I was at University of Maryland studying math, and then September 11th happened, and you could actually see the smoke from the top of the football stadium from the Pentagon. And it was a huge day in my life, like it was for many. Long story short, I went on to join the officer training program and went in as a lieutenant, thinking I was doing the right thing. I believe that weapons of mass destruction narrative, if you remember that, and wanted to do my part to help. By the time I got through school and got through training and actually got to Iraq, we had learned that narrative was wildly wrong, but I did the best that I could. I got a chance to go try out for a small special operations unit called the Ranger Regiment and went to Afghanistan twice with them. And I was more at that point on the support side, so I was a lucky one. I was a bit removed from the most intense of it, but it left some marks on me without question. I mean, almost everyone in the entire unit had some form of PTSD now that I look back. And I got out in 2012 and went to graduate school, and by some measures was doing pretty well. I was at a good school and was putting one foot in front of the other, but I was on the other side of the coin having some real challenges reintegrating back into normal life. And after trying many different traditional modalities, different SSRIs and anti-anxiety medications and cognitive behavioral therapy, without a whole lot of luck, I actually got introduced to meditation through another student at Columbia University who was doing his PhD. And then through that network, over those couple years while I was in school, had the chance to have some professionally facilitated psychedelic experiences, and those were incredibly meaningful for me. And in some ways, it felt like it was accelerating what I was trying to do with meditation, and it definitely had some positive impact on my central nervous system. So the journey kind of started 10, 12 years ago or so when I left the service.
So how did these experiences with PTSD and depression really shape your understanding of holistic well-being?
Yeah, well, I think what I've learned is that the Western system has some really amazing advances, like the technology we have, some of the drugs we have. It's nearly unbelievable, and that's something that we should be proud of as a species. And the system in some ways is incentivized to not necessarily help people heal at a root level. It's more symptom reduction, right? And so I actually found that there's some benefit in looking at it from a more holistic root cause perspective and trying to heal what's broken at the base instead of just doing things to treat the symptoms.
So I know as I did some of my research and kind of looking into your background as preparing for this interview, you mentioned a lot about there being a real divide between, or no real divide between science and spirituality. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think I was probably like many. I grew up exposed to organized religion, Lutheran. My family was Lutheran. We went to church on Christmas and Easter, so we weren't necessarily passionate observers, but I had a really hard time with some of the dogma and some of the self-righteousness and some of the thought exercises you can do in your mind. Well, what happens if a kid passes in Africa that was never exposed to these teachings? And if you ask some Christians, then that person will go to hell, and I just couldn't get my mind around that. And I think that over time, what I've learned is that there's some truths in organized religion, and if you look across them, there's actually quite a fascinating amount of similarity in some of the core teachings, but many of the things have been twisted and changed by man over time because we're flawed and we have desires to manipulate people and to change things. And what I think now is that this idea of God is actually it's a field. It's an energetic field that we can have a better or worse relationship with depending on how we live our life and what we think and what we put in our bodies and how we act. And there's just this kind of field that permeates everything. And if you look at it from a physics perspective, there's actually some physicists that are looking at this. And so I think that this idea of this omnipotent being, it's not just some man in the sky. It's this idea of this huge amount of energy that actually has structure and information in it that we are part of and can have a relationship with. And there's actually a lot of things to be learned from organized religion, but you don't need to take everything. And you also don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can take the pieces that resonate with you and leave the pieces that don't.
Yeah, we've evolved a lot over the last 3 years with this podcast, where we've gone from, both my co-host and I are exercise scientists. I'm an exercise physiologist. That's what my PhD's in. And we've evolved a lot more from just talking the exercise and the physical piece to the point where, like in my own teaching, I emphasize to my students that as we look at the problems with health and performance and all those types of things, it's always biomechanical, psychosocial. We have to include those in there. And we've evolved into talking a lot about what my friend Jay has kind of labeled as SPIES, the spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social aspects of aging and how that's all important. And it's, as you said, I think when we look at God, it is really something bigger than we can comprehend in our own understanding. And I think science is starting to kind of come from one end, and then if people are willing, those that are coming from the more religious side are coming to kind of some of the same points that we're starting to see on the scientific side. So I think it's really fascinating to bring those two aspects of our well-being together, that there's not a distinction between what's happening in the science end and what's happening on the spiritual end.
Right.
And so how do you integrate spiritual practices with evidence-based approaches to mental health?
Yeah, and I really resonate with the point you made, and I think for me, it also just comes down to some level of humility, because there are phenomena that are happening literally moment to moment that we have no idea how it's being done, right? I mean, if you look at our body, for instance, 50 to 100 trillion cells, and within those cells, 50 to 100 trillion, roughly, atoms, and they're all synchronized. They're all moving in a concert. I mean, the complexity is unbelievable. I mean, you can't even in your mind really rationalize a billion, let alone 100 trillion times 2. And then we very casually will sit here and take for granted the fact that we're on a big rock spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, rotating around this big, huge ball of fire, hurtling through this nothingness, right? And just say, oh, we understand everything. And so I think for me, having a math physics background, it was coming to the conclusion that there are things that are, like you said, happening that are so far beyond our ability to rationalize that we should be open to the idea of there being some things that we can't draw on the chalkboard, for example. And how to kind of integrate that? Well, I think once you've maybe convinced yourself enough that you should have some humility around the way things work, I think things start to open up. And there's a physicist whose work I really like. His name's Nassim Harameem, and he gives this talk that he's given all over the world, and he talks about this idea of this field, and it has information, it has energy in it, and it's really technical. And then at the end, he asks the audience for questions, and in one of them, one of the guests says, "Well, so what? Like, okay, so what?" He's like, "The so what is there's a voice, there is an intuition in us, there is something that is different than our rational mind that we can tune into if we have the humility to believe that it's there, and we practice trying to be still enough to hear it." Right? So I think for me personally, and I think for many, one of the foundational practices is meditation. And we don't understand all the mechanics of it, but something very significant happens when you practice being in the present moment more. And we can talk more detail about it, but I mean, you can measure this on an fMRI with a brain scan. When your presence is in the now versus where for most people it is almost all day, telling stories, judging, making sense of, reflecting. There's something really special that happens when you spend more time in that nowness that we're just now beginning to begin to understand.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to kind of dive into that a lot deeper with you today. And so you talk in terms of mindfulness, meditation. You're coming out of a history where you battled with depression and PTSD. What sparked your interest in psychedelics as a tool for healing?
Yeah, it was really that I was at a bit of a rock bottom. And there's the famous poet Rumi, there's a saying or a piece of wisdom that he writes. It's basically when you're on your knees is a good time to pray. So when you're at that rock bottom, sometimes there's some opportunity. And I think that when I was in grad school, that was where I was. And I felt like I had tried everything else. And I started with meditation, and then kind of through that network was introduced to people that had used these plants in a more scientific way, a more structured way that felt more approachable for me, and where I was just wanting to feel better and had felt like I had tried a bunch of different traditional approaches and was looking for something different that wasn't just another pharmaceutical drug that I had lost a lot of faith in the existing system.
Like a lot of us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at this. I mean, it's terrible, and I don't think that nothing, no matter how bad, would justify it. But it is a signal of the trends. I mean, the United Healthcare CEO assassination in New York City in the middle of the day, and then you look at the response from the public. I mean, we're really at a breaking point. I mean, people are just completely fed up with the entire system. So it's certainly time for us to look for other ways to help people.
And psychedelics, I'm in Oregon where it has been legalized for therapy. It's still illegal I assume still illegal in the remaining 49 states. But there's a growing interest in it. There's a growing research behind it. I grew up in the 60s and the 70s where it was more the stoners were doing their shrooms and that kind of stuff. And so I think a lot of people, a lot of our listeners and viewers probably have that image of psychedelics. Can you share a little bit more of this growing research in the benefits of psychedelics and maybe share some of the most compelling findings that you've come across?
Yeah, and yeah, you're right. Oregon is the first state where it's legal. Colorado just became legal with a similar framework to Oregon. And yeah, it does feel like it's changed dramatically over the last few years. And now on our programs, for instance, we have mostly well people that are looking to improve empathy, become more creative, develop better habits, become more connected spiritually, make change, process grief. So we actually screen out more severe indications. But yeah, the research is certainly growing. It looks, the research on the clinical end of the spectrum around PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, looks incredibly promising for psychedelics, particularly relative to SSRIs or some of our more common interventions. But they're not for everyone, and they're not for everything, and they're not without risk. But the body of evidence continues to grow that for some things and some desired outcomes, there's incredible potential here. And I think that what we're learning too is that, again, the Western framework is very based on pharmacology. So it's just take this drug, go on your day, it's going to do what it needs to do without your buy-in or anything. I think psychedelics are a bit different, and to do them in the right way requires intentionality and requires some buy-in from the individual. And so PAT, psychedelic-assisted therapy, is not just, it's called PAT for a reason. It's not just psychedelic, it's the therapy portion. So that the compounds have some way of opening things up, but then there is some requirement to actually do something with it. I think the consensus is that the results and benefits are probably quite limited. If you take the compound in the proper way and do the right things before and the right things after, it looks like you can really lay in some new neural pathways and some new patterning in the central nervous system and body.
Yeah, and psychedelics have really been around for millennia, haven't they, in regards
Thousands
to
of years.
practices spiritually and in healing?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. There's communities in Central America, South America, really anywhere you look. If you go back far enough, you can find some psychedelic use. There's some who believe that even early days of Christianity, there was psychedelic use, and some of these experiences that people were having that they were describing as godly were because they were using these psychoactive plants. And so, yeah, they've been used for thousands of years. In some of these communities, they've been used without pause. If you look at the Huichol in Mexico, for instance. And so that's another reason why I think that there's some real validity into studying them more as potential treatments, because we have this long history of use where we can be quite confident that they're non-toxic, where when you develop a new compound and you start giving it to people that's never existed in nature, there's going to be a lot more risk to what that might do in 20 years. But with these natural plants that have had use all over the world for so long, I think you can make an argument that the relative risk is actually much, much lower.
So for those that are new to the topic, what does the responsible and safe approach to using psychedelics look like?
Yeah, I think the first part is fit and kind of screening. And so some individuals should probably not use psychedelics, or if they do, they need to use them under incredibly close care and oversight. And so people that have psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, bipolar, generally those individuals should be very cautious. Now, previously, the consensus was those individuals should never touch them. Now there's actually some scientists that are saying, no, they can be helpful, they just need to be used in a really controlled way, and there needs to be a lot of support, right? But generally, people that have psychiatric issues need to be very careful. There's also some cardiac risks. So people that have had heart attacks or heart failure, not that they can't, they just need to be aware and need to speak with their primary care and ensure that they're healthy enough to have those experiences. And then once you've screened for the big risks, mushrooms, for instance, are generally well tolerated. So they're non-toxic. You can't take enough that's going to give you an overdose. It's not like many other drugs, right? So the worst case scenario is you take too much, and this actually does happen quite a bit, and then the experience happens and you're in the wrong place with the wrong people, and it's scary. It becomes a traumatic experience because your entire world shifts. So that's why this idea of set and setting is incredibly important with use. So you want to screen people, make sure it's the right people that are looking for the right things to get out of it. And then you want to teach people what to expect, how to navigate the experiences. So there's this idea of like a preparatory phase, which can be a short bit of time or even could be months. And then around the experience, you want to make sure that the set and the setting are right. So if it's your first time, you definitely don't want to do it in a new environment. You don't want to do it where you wouldn't want to do it in a city where there's lots of different stimulus, because you want to just have something that's a more peaceful, calm, controlled. We're big believers in trying to get people in nature where you're kind of away from all the additional stimuli. And then the proper facilitation is really important too. You need people that are there with you that have seen all the different possible outcomes and can help navigate it, because sometimes people have these big experiences and it's important to have someone that can help talk you through it. And then, so if you get the set and the setting right, then I would say another piece of it is the dose or the amount. And this is probably as much art as science, but there's more is not better, right? And you want to give someone an appropriate dose based on where they are. There's this kind of window that you're trying to get people into. You want to give them enough to kind of get them into this right space and not too much where they can't bring the insights back with them. And then after the experience, there's a need for some proper integration. So in some ways it's making sense of the experience, trying to incorporate it into your life. And then also we're big on trying to use that window of neuroplasticity to introduce new habits, because I think what we've found, and I think what's commonly agreed to, is that people can have these experiences, but if they go right back to all their old ways, all their old habits, the benefits are pretty fleeting. So the real magic is using that window of opportunity where there's this openness, this neuroplasticity, to lay in some new patterns, whether that's meditation or gratitude practice or a commitment to being in nature more, or being more intentional with your diet, all those types of things. I think it's really important to reduce the risk of the experience and to get the most out of it.
Listening to this, it almost sounds like, kind of opening this spiritual door for the science to kind of enter the mind and do its trick to kind of heal us appropriately.
I like that. I think it is, opening the door is a very appropriate metaphor.
So what is the mission of Beckley Retreats, and how does its programs kind of support this idea of holistic health?
Yeah, we want to make these transformational experiences accessible to all. So the name Beckley comes from the Beckley Foundation, which was started by this woman by the name of Amanda Fielding, who's in her 80s, and she's been studying psychedelics her entire life, and she's a really iconic woman and quite famous in this small psychedelic world. And through the Beckley Foundation, she was studying the benefits of psychedelics. Really, for the last 60 years, the foundation was started in 1990. So officially under the foundation for 25 years. And they were doing two things. They were doing research to understand the benefits and the risks, and doing international drug policy reform. And her brilliance was really seeing that you needed to do both. You couldn't get the laws changed if you didn't have good data to lobby, and you couldn't do good research if the laws were so restrictive they didn't allow research. So all over the world, she's been trying to make change. And we really owe her and some of these indigenous communities and some of these other innovators and researchers a lot of respect and admiration, because it's because of them we're able to have this conversation now. 10 years ago, this wouldn't have happened. I mean, what we're talking about, it was wildly taboo, and only in the last few years it's even become possible to talk about openly. And now Yale, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Berkeley, they all have psychedelic research centers, right? They're all publishing data because we know that there's some truth here. And so Amanda and her family, a handful of years ago, realized that the world was changing and it was time to get the work out of the labs and try and get it to more people. And so we established Beckley Retreats as an offshoot of the Beckley Foundation to run programs where people could have safe access to these experiences.
And it would seem, even in your best efforts right now, until the laws really change, it's hard to permit that greater accessibility, because like most of your programs, because they can't be done in the United States, or you have to take people out of the continental United States. I see some of them are Netherlands, Jamaica, which are great. I mean, I think most people would love to just take a nice retreat vacation to the Netherlands or to Jamaica. But again, it's inaccessible to a lot of Americans that probably could really benefit from, particularly as I think of the individuals like yourself that serve their country and are coming back with PTSD. And it's not like they're rolling in the cash to be able to support some of these programs. And I do notice that I think you have scholarships as well, which I applaud that you're making as much effort to make this as accessible as possible. And I think that definitely should be applauded. Can you kind of walk us through some of the policies that Beckley Retreats follows to ensure safe and ethical practices with psychedelics?
Yeah, definitely. And on the accessibility piece, we're a public benefit corporation. So the way I look at that is it's kind of an in-between of a for-profit and a non-profit. And so we have a dual mission, which is to be sustainable, but to also increase accessibility. And like you said, we're suboptimally solving this problem right now because we can't do it in the United States. And so it's very inaccessible for most people to be able to take the time and spend the money to come and do it in these remote locations. We're quite hopeful, though, that if we go 5 years, 10 years in the future, we'll be able to have centers where they need to be, which is closer to the people that they serve, right? And I think that right now the costs are high because it's a newer industry, but we have a vision where we can get the costs much lower so that your average police officer or returning veteran could go away for a week, a year, do some of this work within their community, recommit to better habits, and it's just incredible value that most people want to do it. That's really what we're working towards. We're just getting started. We're only a few years in. And then on your question around the policies, I mean, it's similar to the things I talked about earlier to ensure a safe experience, right? So we have an application process where we get a bunch of the guests' data, and then we have a call with each potential guest to make sure that what they're looking for is what we're suited to be able to offer, and then it's a good fit. And so there's a very robust screening program. And then before the immersive portion, we have a prep portion where we're teaching people a lot of these basic well-being practices. So we're teaching meditation, we're teaching mindful movement, breath work. We're giving them some tools to understand how to navigate these experiences. And it's in modules so that they can kind of on their own go through this learning journey before they get to the on-site portion. And then when we're on site, the site selection really matters. So our facilities are deep in nature, away from everything. Some places you can have these experiences and there might be a wedding next door. We think that's just not optimal. So we really want people to be able to have a digital detox and just be with the facilitators in their group. And then we give everyone a custom amount, which is a discussion between them and the senior facilitators. It's around the amount that you would see in clinical trials in the United States for mushrooms. So it's within a predefined range, but it's a discussion between that individual and the senior facilitators. A lot of our guests, it's their first time doing something like this, so you go a bit lower on that first experience and then allow the trust to be built more between the guests and the facilitators and let someone have a little bit lighter experience so they can see that it's not so scary. And then generally in that second one, people are ready to go up to a more full dose. I would say we have probably some of the best facilitators in the world, which is really important. So our facilitators have done this for many years and can properly support the group. I think many of the facilitators really appreciate continuing Amanda Fielding's legacy. And we pay really well too. So I think we get to be very selective on who we allow to come into our organization and be part of our program. So we have very highly skilled facilitators. And then on the back end, we have an integration period too, where our guests get continued access to our catalog of content and the practical exercises. And we bring the group back together a few more times. And if any of our guests need additional support, we can provide one-on-one support. We do that quite regularly. So we really think about this whole kind of, it's more of like an integrative health program that uses psychedelics as opposed to just a psychedelic experience. We think we're really trying to help people create new habits.
And I think it's important for the listeners and viewers that might be in those other 48 states that might still be considering whether or not to legalize such therapy in their states, that might be a little bit more hesitant because, again, their history or their experience might be more like mine, where it was the psychedelics of the 60s and the 70s, and thinking that these retreats are just simply an opportunity for people to just go and have a psychedelic experience for 5 days. This is really about healing individuals, changing mindsets, and doing something very positive and productive for the people who are engaging in these therapies. And so what role do you see psychedelics and mindfulness really playing in the future of mental health care in the US and beyond?
Yeah, and I think that to the point that you made, it's people are coming to become better versions of themselves. People are coming because they want to be better fathers or sons or business partners. They want to be more empathetic. They want to be more present. They want to be less reactive. So there's real benefits to the individuals, but then there's benefit to those families and communities that these individuals go back to and are parts of. And I mean, I've seen it, and I think if you look at the data, what people are reporting after these experiences too, people are gentler, kinder, more thoughtful. So there's some real value here. But the way in which it's used is incredibly important. I mean, you can use these experiences, you can just get high. And it's like cannabis, right? I think that there's some real benefit to cannabis, or you can use it to tune out and run away from your problems and you can be a pothead. So I think we kind of missed the ball on cannabis. We went from can't talk about it, it's the devil's weed, to everybody should do it, there's no risk. I don't think that's right either. I think that the truth is in the middle somewhere, where it's for the right things and with the proper intention and way, there's benefit. Outside of that, there's still risk. So I think that's what we really want to be a part of, is having that conversation and educating people around the proper use and when and how. And the future, well, I think there's a couple of things. I think that what will happen pretty soon is that it'll be incorporated into the existing medical system. So a doctor will be able to prescribe psilocybin, for instance, for clinical indications. Someone has depression, instead of giving them an SSRI, they'll be able to give them a prescription for psilocybin to do it in a clinic for a couple times or something like this. And I think that, again, with all drugs, some work better for others than others. We're kidding ourselves when we think that this is the answer, but I think that these compounds will give a doctor another potential tool to try that in many cases might be a better fit. Like I said earlier, at least they're non-toxic. A lot of the drugs that we take have incredible toxicity on the body, so at least we're not doing that. And so I think you'll see psychedelics incorporated into the existing medical system and being used similar to how pharmaceuticals are being used today. And what I'm hopeful for and what we're more focused on is I hope that psychedelics will be incorporated more into just healthy living and more preventative health programs where well people, before they get clinically depressed, before they develop severe alcohol addiction, can go through programs to learn how to take better care of themselves and learn how to use these plants and other plants as complements to a healthy lifestyle. And so I'm really hopeful that we can, as a society, move away from this very late stage expensive intervention once things are really bad and start teaching people at a younger age that there's different ways to live and be and habits that you can develop that'll actually keep you well, and maybe you don't need all that expensive late stage intervention.
You know, we tend to really emphasize the preventative side of healthcare on this podcast. I'm very skeptical of kind of modern medicine and its reactive approach to the treatment of disease. We wait until people are really sick and then we just say, take a pill. Do you feel like, or you have any apprehension that the medical community could really screw up the benefits of psychedelics?
Yeah, I mean, it's like many things, right? There's many sides, and some things that seem mutually exclusive can be true at the same time. I mean, I told you at the beginning before we started, but I just lost my mom this year, which losing your mom is a big one, and so I spent a lot of time with her in the hospital in her last stages, and I couldn't help but be amazed at the technology that what she had access to. She would have easily died way sooner 20 years ago because they didn't have all the tools. So I was so thankful for that. And I was literally losing my temper because they wouldn't let her open the window to get fresh air in because that wasn't in the protocol. And at one point in time, she was at this level of care, so where they had to wake her up at night every couple hours to check her vitals when really what she needed was a decent night's sleep. It was just like insanity to be in there and see just how rigid and just mechanical the system was without heart or thought. And so, yes, I'm skeptical of the system to overgeneralize being able to use these compounds that are quite different in a way that is optimal. But I'm optimistic that it's kind of right on time. There's people like yourself and others that are trumpeting this other way of being. And so I think we'll see some slow change from within the system, but we're going to see this kind of movement that's happening outside the system, that's required too. I'll never forget this New York Times article that I saw a few years ago, which goes back to our earlier discussions around spirit kind of and this humility around understanding how things work. But the article, the title was, "There's no scientific reason why Reiki works. So why does it?" And it was about Reiki, this idea of energy healing being incorporated into the Western medical system. And it wasn't because the top level administrators were saying, let's get Reiki in here. It was because there was a bottoms up community movement saying they're demanding it, right? And we don't know how Reiki works, right? It seems pretty woo, right? It seems pretty fluffy. But for some people, it's pretty clear it has some benefit. So I'm thinking that we're on this precipice of things really changing in a positive way, but we'll have to wait and see.
I hope so. I really do. I really hope we're on that precipice. And I'd like to get off the precipice and be into the much more active phase of it all, but time will tell. So what advice would you offer to somebody who is curious about exploring plant-based treatments and meditation for their own well-being?
Yeah, do the research. There's a lot of information out there. MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, is a very well-respected organization that has quite a catalog of content where you can go and read these different research studies if you really want to kind of get into the nuts and bolts and you're quite science-oriented. So that's a good place to start. And then there's actually quite a few good books and documentaries. I mean, the How to Change Your Mind, written by Michael Pollan, I would say is a must-read for someone that's maybe a bit skeptical but curious, because I think he does a great job of just using plain language and science and objectivity. And then that was converted into a Netflix multi-part series. And so I think that you can take a look at that too. And it's really well done and it's fascinating. And then, I mean, if you are interested in the programs that we do one-on-one calls and we're super responsive. So if people want to reach out and ask more about what our programs are like, we'll always make time to connect with people to answer questions.
Yeah, so with that in mind, where can our listeners and our viewers connect with you and learn more about Beckley Retreats? Obviously, I've talked about the webpage, so we can kind of state that. And is there any other social media or other access points?
Yeah, we're on LinkedIn and Instagram. It's Beckley Retreats with an S. If you Google Beckley Retreats, we'll come up. You can also take a look at the Beckley Foundation website. That's a good place for a good bit of research. We work closely with them. We do twice weekly group calls, but we also do one-on-one calls. So you can just go to our site, book a one-on-one, and speak with someone on our team. And we understand that this is a big decision, and many people it's quite new. So it's not uncommon for us to speak with someone multiple times or connect them with a previous guest or two, and then they want to speak with a facilitator that's going to lead the program. That's all fine. We're happy to do it.
And how frequent are your retreats?
We do about 2 a month.
And roughly how many people would be participating in a retreat? I can't imagine that there's hundreds in a single retreat, but there's probably maybe small groups.
Each retreat's about 15 individuals, 15 to 20, yeah.
Now, is the demand for that growing pretty rapidly?
Yes, yeah, I think it's coming. I think that these last few years they have these like acceptance curves that you can see for all types of kind of new innovations. And I think we're at this early adopter phase, and then we're moving into this more mass acceptance phase, because I think the research is overwhelmingly clear now that there's something here. And it went from wildly taboo to, there was just an article in the New York Times talking about CEOs using psychedelics to become better leaders. Aaron Rodgers talks about ayahuasca and how it helped him as an NFL quarterback. You have Prince Harry that used it to help deal with depression. So it's kind of all in the mass media now. And so I think that these next few years is going to see tremendous growth, which is exciting. And it's a bit of the Wild West right now. So I encourage people to do their research and do it wisely, do it thoughtfully.
And I'm assuming you're not the only group out there that's doing the psychedelic therapy. What should somebody look for as they are trying to explore, where should I go for this therapy? Who should I investigate with, or what kind of questions should I ask?
Yeah, I think I would ask questions kind of similar to what we talked about earlier, like what makes it safe. I would ask about, is there a preparation period? I would ask about the caliber of their facilitators. I would ask, what's the group size? I would ask, how do they think about the dosing? Are they insured? Is what they're doing legal? What's the qualifications of the facilitators? Is it part of a comprehensive program, or is it just time for people to come do a drug and go on about their business? So I would ask some questions. How long has the organization been around? Can you speak with a previous guest? Do they have prominent reviews online like you would if choosing a new doctor or something, right? You'd want to ask some friends and try and find some people that have had some personal experience with it. But I don't want to be the boogeyman, because I don't think that these experiences are particularly more risky than a lot of the things we do in a normal daily life. I think that in many ways these experiences are safer than going out on a Friday night with friends and going to a bar, right? But there are risks, and there's little central controls right now in terms of regulation. So you have to look for organizations that are policing themselves, right? And so it's definitely this time where people need to be a bit more thoughtful and definitely ask more questions while this industry is becoming more developed.
Seems like the environment would be a key piece of it as well. I mean, not everybody's going to be able to go take a retreat, but somebody might be doing some long-term therapy. They're going into, say, a doctor's office in Portland, Oregon, where they're getting the therapy. But it seems like how that treatment is being implemented is going to be a critical factor in the benefits. And so it's less about the risk as much as how much benefit am I really getting out of this particular therapy. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. And this idea of set and setting, some of the psychonauts that have been in this world for a long time would say that the set and setting is more important than the compound. So who you're with, where you are, the why, how the environment feels, like all that really matters, because these compounds are doing something different than your normal pharmaceutical. So I think that the data is pretty clear on these experiences in a clinic, in a doctor's office. It looks like there's some benefit there for sure. But I would think that the more optimal experiences is places that closer to nature, away from all of the additional stimulus. And I mean, we don't know for sure, but all the electromagnetic fields that are happening in cities, I think in an optimal scenario, you would try and avoid those while having these experiences, because it's a little, there's just a lot going on in major metropolitan areas that is affecting our central nervous system, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. And then, I mean, I think part of it too is this work is also about retuning into that intuition. We've outsourced our well-being fully to the system, right? Where we go, we see this expert who in 20 minutes can diagnose us and tell us what we need to do, where there's value in that, but it's quite limited. So we've got to learn how to develop this intuition and listen to that. And if you get on the phone with one of these clinics, how does it make you feel? Does it feel comfortable? Does it feel welcoming? Or does your body constrict? And are you getting other signals, right? Like, I think that all that really matters. And we should trust ourselves a bit more once we've learned how to develop that intuition a bit.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to underscore as we talk about kind of modern medicine and how we interact with it. So many of us have really no intuition when it comes to going to our doctor and having that conversation and how do I feel? How many people go to a doctor and they feel like they don't listen to me, or I am not getting the treatment that I like because I have this appearance issue or something like that. And they don't say, well, maybe I should go to a different doctor, or maybe I should ask different questions, or maybe I should stand up for myself a little bit more. And so I think you're making some very important points. And again, I mentioned earlier about my apprehension about some of modern medicine, particularly the pharmaceutical companies. And I do have some concerns of their getting a hold of this as it becomes more and more legal and really corrupting it. And I think it's important for our listeners and our viewers to be mindful of that. And as we explore getting this accessible to all Americans and people throughout the globe, that we're conscientious and a bit more intuitive about how do we allow this to be developed within our country so that we're not handing it over to the pharmaceutical companies. So our doctor's going to say, here's your prescription for insert psychedelic, and go home and take it twice a day. Of course, we want you to be in a more meditative state, so lay down, take it, and rest for 30 minutes or whatever. Not really focusing in on the real benefits that these treatments and therapies can have for people.
Absolutely. I hope for that too.
I'm sure you do. And I hope it comes for you, because I'm really kind of excited, especially with this conversation, where it can be taking mental health for this country and well-being in general. As we start to connect the dots on this podcast, that spiritual and physical are not disconnected, and our well-being and our health is hugely dependent upon being mindful, being meditative, having that spiritual connection with our bodies. This is going to be an important way of, I think, managing our aging well, so to speak. Is there anything we missed in today's conversation that you want to kind of bring to the conversation to share with our viewers and listeners?
No, it was great. I guess I can't close out, though, without re-emphasizing, in my personal opinion, how important meditation is. And I think that that's a great place to start. And I encourage people, if they don't already, to look for a formal meditation program and commit and try it for a few months. It's one of these things where if you do it one time or two times or three times, you won't have fully experienced the potential benefit. And so you won't know whether it's good for you or not. And so you need to give it a couple months of pretty continuous effort before you can make an informed decision of whether it's good for you or not. And so I just encourage people to, maybe it's the beginning of the new year, maybe people want to take on some new commitments, try a few months of a formal meditation program and see how much it positively impacts your life. And if people want more information on that, they can always reach out to us too. We're happy to get people pointed in the right direction.
Sounds great. And we always ask this of all our guests, what are you doing personally to age well? I mean, obviously you're practicing meditation, and I might ask you a little bit more about what you do specifically, but what are you doing personally to age well?
Yeah, meditation, exercise, time in nature, sunshine, purposeful work, good community, good relationships.
Checking all the right boxes.
I'm learning and trying.
So what would a day look like for you in terms of your meditative practices?
I usually wake up, and before I get out of bed, I'll meditate for 20 to 25 minutes just laying down. People always ask, well, how do you not fall back asleep? I don't know how. I just don't. And so that's a great time. I think that there's this kind of window that happens between sleep and and between awake, where there's this meditation is maybe even a little bit easier. And then I typically get up, we'll have some coffee or some tea, and then go for a walk or do some exercise, and then come back and usually do 20 to 25 minutes of meditation sitting, or sometimes I lay back down. So usually before I kind of get into the world, I've meditated for 40 to 60 minutes, which sounds like a lot. I know that is something that I've been working on for 10 years, and so you don't need to feel like you need to do that out the gate. I think 5 to 10 minutes a day is a good place to start. And then I try to have moments throughout the day where I just bring my awareness back to the now. So if I'm listening to someone, I'll just pay attention to them, but also be aware of my breath while I'm listening. They can't tell that you're doing that, so it's not going to be weird, only that you're paying attention to your breath. But there's all these different tools that you can use to try and just be more present through the day. And then usually in the evening before I go to bed, I'll meditate for 15 to 20 minutes, sometimes seated or sometimes laying down. So an hour to hour and a half each day, I think, is a sweet spot for me. But I also think that I'm wired on one end of the spectrum where I'm in my head a lot. If I don't work hard to counter that, I'm telling stories and contemplating and problem solving. I think that people that are naturally wired that way require a little bit more effort to be present. Some people, I think it's just more natural. Artists and athletes and folks that are more kind of naturally flow state maybe don't need to do it as much as I do, but lucky for them.
Yeah. So being in the DC area, how much does the traffic and just the hustle and bustle of that city cause you to kind of disrupt that meditative flow that you might be in as you meditated for 40 minutes in the morning, you get in the car? I mean, that's a problem for me is I'll journal in the morning and meditate, and then I get into the car and I have an hour commute. So it doesn't take me long on the highway before it's like, I just disrupted all of that I worked toward.
Yeah, it's tougher, for sure, especially if you live in a city and you have a big, complicated job or a new family. It's going to require probably more effort. But I love this saying that's, if you're busy, you should meditate. If you're really busy, you should meditate more. It's not about getting to some end state, right? You're not going to all of a sudden meditate and then everything's all good. It's this realization that there's kind of these new ways of being that require constant effort. So you're always getting back on the horse. You're always trying to be present and then losing presence, going back to your old ways, getting overstimulated and then coming back. That's meditation at its core. So that's never going to change. So it's just keep practicing, keep trying. That's it.
I think for a lot of us, just simply putting that phone down for 10 minutes could be a form of meditation. Just to completely disconnect from everything and just listen to ourselves, focus on our breathing, and just focus on where am I right now, not what's going on in the world, who tweeted what, or who's doing what on Instagram, or what's on YouTube. Just distance ourselves, sit down, and just reflect.
Yeah. Jon Kabat-Zinn, who developed MBSR, which is mindfulness-based stress reduction. He was a doctor at the University of Massachusetts, and that's the technique that I found when I first got started, and I still really appreciate it. But he defines meditation as paying attention to the present moment on purpose without judgment. And so you can do that any time in the middle of the day. And so if you're in traffic and you're frustrated, you can zoom out a bit and notice that you're frustrated and feel the frustration, and just be aware of the difference between that and then going into this mode where you're telling stories about the frustration and I'll get out of, or all the things you can or could do. There's a difference, and you can actually measure this on a brain scan. So meditation doesn't mean you're never frustrated or angry. It's that you're kind of aware of it instead of lost in the thought stream, as John Cabot said. So it can be a really good meditation practice to try and catch yourself when you're in those moments. And zoom out a bit and see if you can't observe that self getting all worked up. Because if you can be there, you're in a meditative state, even in that moment of frustration. There's that slight difference between kind of being in it and observing it. That's what we're looking for.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, they tend to think of meditation as being kind of get in a yoga position, chanting some mantra for 20 minutes at a time, and totally just kind of getting into that nirvana state, which really isn't what most of us are going to be able to do. Most of it is just quieting the noise in our brains and listening to what I would say is kind of the universe talking to us and telling us what we need to be doing.
100%. I think there's some real truth to that. And there's some physicists that would agree with you too, that if you get quiet enough, you are hearing some things that the universe or God or the oneness or spirit is trying to communicate to you, but many of us don't ever get quiet enough to be able to hear.
Yeah, we're too busy being noisy. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I feel like we could keep talking and go on, but I know you have a lot to do. This is the new year for us. We're kind of recording this on New Year's morning, which I appreciate you kind of doing it on a holiday. I just want to thank you for your time today. I hope that our listeners will know that they got some valuable information here. I'm not going to say I hope our listeners got some valuable information, because it's there if they want to listen to it and hear it. But to use this information to process it, even if they're not interested in psychedelic therapy for themselves, but explore it to understand how it could be beneficial to many people in this country that can benefit from it, and how it can be used to help us to have better mental health, just be better people. And so as our states are starting to explore whether or not we should legalize the therapy, make it more accessible to people, to be more open to it, whether it's something that they feel like they would use it themselves or not, just explore it to a point where you can say, okay, I understand this now. I think this could be beneficial. And I'm saying this particularly to my neighbors here in Oregon, is we've legalized it, but there's still some pushback where there's that potential where people are trying to withdraw that. And I think it's important that we do the research and understand what the therapy can do and benefit, and how it has benefited people, and be open to it so that it is more accessible to people. So you've kind of put me up on a soapbox here, and I appreciate that. I have plenty of soapboxes to get onto, but this is one I will definitely get onto. I hope that the listeners that are interested in this will share the information with some others. It's a good way for us to grow the podcast, but also to grow interest and potential for the therapies that you're doing through Beckley Retreats. So I just thank you for your time today, and keep doing what you're doing, and keep aging well.
Thank you, Jeff. It was a pleasure. Nice meeting you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast, and until next time, keep aging well.